that dust did not settle. It simply clung, a fine ochre shroud that coated the skin, choked the lungs, and painted the sky in an eternal, sickly haze. Ahead the horizon shimmered, promising not a destination, but a myth. It was 1845, and for Eliza Thorne, the myth had a name: Oregon. Eliza stood beside the massive, canvas-covered Conestoga wagon, her eyes fixed on the man who had traded everything their farm in Missouri. Her mother's silver locket, his very certainty for this impossible journey. Her husband, Thomas, looked gaunt, the usual fiery zeal in his eyes dimmed by weeks of relentless sun and exhaustion. "It's a promised land, Eliza," he'd whispered back in St. Louis, his hand gesturing grandly toward a tattered map. "A place where a man can own land, breathe free, and build a dynasty." But freedom, Eliza had quickly learned, had a suffocating price. The first few weeks had been a parade of naive optimism, a throng of hopeful families, their wagons creaking a hopeful song across the prairies. Now, 3 months in, the song had turned into a mournful dip. The once clear rivers were often brackish or simply vanished. The trail, once clearly marked by earlier travelers, now branched into confusing, treacherous, rudsa spiderweb of false starts and dead ends. The allure of the West, the promise of endless fertile land, forests untouched by the axe, and a new beginning far from the established East was the invisible engine pulling them forward. It was a siren's call, a powerful psychological force rooted in the American spirit of relentless expansion. It spoke to the deepest hunger of the common man, the craving for self. Yet, the frontier was a merciless judge. She watched as a young boy, no older than 10, was buried just yesterday, fever having claimed him in the night. The very earth they sought to claim now received their dead. Oxen had succumbed to disease and overwork. Tools broke and couldn't be replaced. The biggest threat wasn't hunger or even the lurking uncertainty of Native American tribes whose land they were. It was the sheer, brutal monotony of suffering, the unrelenting weariness that eroded hope faster than the wagon wheels wore down the iron rims. As the sun began its brutal descent, casting long, menacing shadows across the great plains, Thomas returned, his face green. "The Platte River is shallower than they said," he reported, wiping sweat from his brow. "We'll have to double-team the wagons across, or risk losing everything to the mud." He saw the fear in Eliza's eyes, that deep-set doubt that mirrored his own private terror. He reached for her hand, his touch rough and comforting. "We are halfway, Eliza. We are pioneers. We endure because the land waiting for us, it is worth the cost." But as he said the words, even Thomas couldn't help but look back toward the east, wondering, for a fleeting, terrifying second, if the treacherous trails were not just the terrain, but the journey itself, a crucible designed to break everything they were, before forging them into something entirely new. The dream was still alive, but now it tasted of dust and desperation. The dream of Oregon had curdled, replaced by the frenetic, gold-laced delirium of California. News traveled faster than the wagons, carried by returning, defeated souls and frantic, hopeful prospectors. The word was not land or farm, but gold. It was a fever, sudden and irresistible, and it had swept up Thomas Thorne just as the dust of the Great Plains had begun to settle on his hopes. "They're pulling nuggets out of the streams, Eliza, simply pulling them out." Thomas had declared, his eyes finally alight again, but with a wild, unsettling glare. The decision, like all their major decisions on the trail, was hasty and driven by desperation. They steered the Conestoga south, abandoning the fertile promise of the Willamette Valley for the unforgiving canyons of the Sierra Nevada. The year was 1849, the peak of the rush. They settled, or rather, squatted, in a hastily erected camp near what would soon be called Sutter's Creek. The settlement was a chaotic, muddy, and exhilarating monument to human ambition. Tents pitched beside hastily built wooden shanties, saloons that doubled as general stores, and the constant, rhythmic scrape of shovels and pans. The community here was forged in the same crucible of survival that had tested them on the trail, but with a critical difference. Greed was the primary architect of the new order. Men from every corner of the globe, Americans from the east, Mexicans from Sonora, Frenchmen, Chinese stood shoulder to shoulder in the frigid streams. Yet a palpable tension ran through the camp. A man might share his last scrap of bacon at night, only to threaten another with a claim jump at dawn. Eliza found her own role. The gold was for the men. The business was for her. She was a silent partner, using the small store of supplies Thomas had salvaged to bake corn bread and fry up meager rations of dried beans. She charged exorbitant prices, $1 for a biscuit, $5 for a cup of lukewarm coffee, prices that would have been highway robbery back in Missouri. But here, they were simply the price of hope. It was a trade built on the miners' tunnel vision, their absolute focus on the gold at the expense of every basic necessity. Gold is worthless, she realized. Watching men pay a day's digging for a simple pair of serviceable boots unless someone else is selling what you need to live. One blistering afternoon, a small, gaunt prospector named Silas found a vein. Not flakes, but a true, glorious pocketed tangle of quartz and yellow metal the size of his fist. The cheer that erupted quickly turned savage. Within the hour, his small claim was surrounded, and the community's veneer of camaraderie shattered. The unbreakable bonds of shared struggle were tested by the weight of instant, unbelievable wealth. Men who had shared whiskey and stories now brandished pickaxes like weapons. Thomas, witnessing the frenzy, felt the same dark tug of avarice. He and Eliza had made enough from her makeshift bakery to survive, but not enough to leave. The gold rush was not about steady profit. It was about the jackpot. "We need a claim, Eliza," Thomas urged, his voice low and tight that evening as they sat by their sputtering fire. "We're just surfacing the winners. We need to be the winners and kill a man for a rock," Eliza counted, stirring the bean pot. "Silas has a broken arm. 3 men jumped him, and the campus barely prevented a shooting. This gold, it turns men into wolves, Thomas. But the true test of their bond came not from the greedy crowd, but from the brutal element of survival. That winter, the Sierra Nevada demonstrated its true power. Snow fell relentlessly, isolating Sutter's Creek. Supplies dwindled, and Eliza's pantry, once a source of modest income, became the camp's last reservoir of sustenance scurvy set in. The weak died quietly in their tents, in that black, desperate time. The other side of the community, true, enduring, bonds reasserted itself. The men who hadn't struck it rich, those who still possessed their moral compass, coalesced. They pooled their meager remaining resources. Thomas, forgetting the phantom gold, used his strength to help build a crude, sturdy shelter for the sick. Eliza, using her skill and whatever dried herbs she could scrounge, nursed the feverish. The gold rush, it seemed, was not just an examination of human greed. It was an ultimate test of human character. They were no longer partners in the pursuit of wealth, but partners in the defense of life. When the Sprento finally came, washing away the mud and the memories of the dead, Eliza looked at Thomas. He was thinner, scarred by the hardship and the moral ugliness he had witnessed. But the wildfire of greed was gone, replaced by a deep, wary resolution. They hadn't struck it rich, but they had survived the ultimate trial of the 49er. They had their lives. And crucially, they still had each other. Their bond, having bent under the immense pressure of gold fever, had proven itself unbreakable. 15 years had passed since the madness of 49. Thomas and Eliza Thorne, now older, wiser, and settled in the burgeoning border state of Kansas, no longer chased gold. They owned a small but respectable general store in Lawrence, a town founded by abolitionists, a volatile island of free soil ideology surrounded by vast prairies sympathetic to the Southern cause. The peace they had purchased with their hard-won stability was a fragile illusion. The air in Kansas in the year 1860 did not smell of dust or pine. It smelled of gunpowder and fear. This was not the struggle of man against nature, but the far more bitter struggle of brother against brother, of idea against idea. The great national question of slavery had arrived on their doorstep violently. The territory was a testing ground, a microcosm of the coming national split, earning it the grim nickname Bleeding Kansas. Every wagon that passed, every customer who entered their store carried a political alignment as clear as a uniform. Eliza, who had seen the ugliest aspects of human greed in the gold rush, was staunchly anti. Her pragmatic nature, hardened by the frontier, rejected the entire notion of owning another human being. Thomas, however, a man of Missouri heritage, wrestled with a more complex, painful loyalty. He didn't support slavery, but he vehemently opposed the dissolution of the Union. It's about property rights, Eliza, and state sovereignty, he argued one humid evening, shutters bolted tight against the rising tension outside. He spoke the language of compromise, but his voice lacked conviction. We leave them alone, they leave us alone. It keeps the peace. Peace, Eliza scoffed, wiping down the scarred wooden counter. There is no peace, Thomas. When men cross the border from Missouri to burn homes and threaten us simply for believing a black man is a human being, that is not peace. That is tyranny. The ideological conflict wasn't abstract. It was personal. Their neighbor Silisas, a miner from Sutter's Creek who had barely survived the gold frenzy, was now an fiery jayhawker, a Free State militia member. He visited the store not for supplies, but for fervent, whispered strategy, his eyes bright with revolutionary zeal. Contrastingly, Thomas's own cousin, a man named Jesse who'd followed them west, lived just across the border and was an active border ruffian committed to ensuring Kansas entered the Union as a slave state. Their familial bond, once a lifeline in the unforgiving West, was now a painful knot of political antagonism. The tension reached a terrifying climax one autumn afternoon. A band of border ruffians, drunk on cheap whiskey and ideological rage, rode into Lawrence. ostensibly searching for runaway slaves, but truly seeking confrontation. Jesse was among them. He entered the Thorne store, his presence filling the small space with an awful blend of familiarity and menace. He wore a heavy wool coat, despite the heat, and beneath it, Thomas knew, was a pistol. "Cousin Thomas," Jesse said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "Word is, you've been harboring Silas and his abolitionist ilk. That is a dangerous game for a man whose store sits on the wrong side of the creek." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Jesse and the hidden back room where Lisa was tending to an injured Silas. This was the moment of testing. His years of avoiding the hard truth, of clinging to a fragile notion of neutrality, had evaporated. "My store sells flour and coffee," Jesse Thomas stated, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It doesn't sell men, and it doesn't sell out friends. We are in Kansas. This is a free territory." Jesse's smile vanished. "Then you're a traitor to your blood and a fool to your future." The moment hung, taut and silent. Thomas saw not a man seeking justice, but a man corrupted by an ideology that demanded loyalty above morality. The lessons of 49 were clear. Survival wasn't just about food. It was about choosing a side, a truth, and defending it. He realized that the revolution wasn't coming. It was already here. A quiet, corrosive war waged in the heart. "You've worn out your welcome, Jesse," Thomas said, his hand resting lightly on a heavy axe handle near the counter. "I suggest you ride back across the river before you forget which side of this boundary you stand on." Jesse stared for a long moment, registering the finality in Thomas's eyes. He turned and swaggered out, leaving the Thorne store stained with the scent of a broken bond. That night, as the distant sound of gunfire echoed across the prairie, Thomas and Eliza packed a small bag for Silas and helped him escape into the darkness. Thomas had finally chosen his side. The whispers had become shouts, and the revolution, though not yet officially declared, had claimed the Thornes as its own. Their fight for land and life had transformed into a fight for the soul of the nation. The cannons fell silent, but the tremors did not cease. The Civil War had concluded, redefining the Union. Yet the new conflict was waged not with powder and shot, but with steel and steam. By 1868, Thomas and Eliza Thorne had sold their war-weary store in Lawrence and ventured further west. Following the scent of the next great American enterprise, the Transcontinental Railroad, they settled near a rapidly growing, volatile outpost in the Utah Territory, where the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines were racing toward their historic meeting point. The change wrought by the railroad was immediate and overwhelming. It was the physical manifestation of American will, a relentless iron artery pulsing across the continent. Thomas found work surveying and managing logistics for a Union Pacific subcontractor, a brutal, demanding job that required him to stand guard over the immense capital investment. Eliza, seeing the endless tide of workers, Irish, Chinese, ex-soldiers, and freedmen, established a mobile commissary. Her tent and wagon operation followed the grading crews, selling provisions not just for survival, but for the basic comforts of a rapidly evolving workforce. The landscape itself was being irrevocably altered. The vast, Silent plains that had once taken Eliza and Thomas months of fearful travel to cross were now being sliced by a straight, uncompromising line. The buffalo herds, the traditional lifeblood of the plains, were vanishing, hunted to near extinction to feed the crews and clear the way for the tracks. It's not just the land we're changing, Eliza Thomas said one evening, looking out at the enormous temporary shanty town that sprung up behind the tracks. It's time. We are collapsing distance. What took us 6 months to reach now takes 6 days. This compression of distance and time was the most profound technological advancement of the era, and it fundamentally altered the American way of life. Suddenly, markets in New York could influence prices in San Francisco within weeks. Information, resources, and people moved with unprecedented speed. The isolated frontier that had shaped the early lives of the Thornes was vanishing, replaced by a connected, integrated, and far more complex nation. However, the building of this steel behemoth came at a terrible human cost. The work was brutal. Workers died from exhaustion, accidents, and skirmishes with the Native American tribes, Ta, Pani, Sioux, and others who rightly saw the railroad as an existential threat to their way of life. The railroad companies, fueled by massive government subsidies, and driven by a ruthless competitive spirit, valued speed and profit over the well-being of their laborers. Eliza often treated the railroad workers, the Chinese laborers, with their meticulous, disciplined work ethic, often paid less than their white counterparts. The hard-drinking Irish, the black freedmen seeking a new start, all broken by the unrelenting demands of the construction. She saw the new face of American ambition. Not just the honest struggle for a piece of land, but the naked exploitation of labor to achieve massive corporate gain. The climax of their time on the line came in the spring of 1869. The rival crews were only miles apart. The competitive frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Stakes were high. Fortunes were made and lost daily on the speed of the Thomas, overseeing a critical section of trek near Promontory Summit, found himself in a moral bind. His foreman, a hardened, cynical man named Mr. Doyle, ordered him to use inferior, damaged ties to gain a 2-day lead over the Central Pacific. "They'll hold for the ceremony, Thorne," Doyle hissed. "We get paid for completion, not longevity. The line has to meet." Thomas looked at the fragile ties, then at the sturdy, permanent iron rails. His conscience, forged in the fires of survival and political conviction, balked. He thought of the trains that would carry families, like his own once was, across this vast space. A faulty track wasn't just corporate deceit. It was a potential massacre. He disobeyed the order. That night, he quietly directed a small, loyal crew, a mix of Chinese and black workers too, replaced the shoddy ties with sound timber, delaying Doyle's section by precious hours. The next day, Thomas was confronted, threatened, and ultimately fired by Doyle. But 2 days later, on May 10th, 1869, Thomas and Eliza stood a distance away and watched the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory. They saw the 2 locomotives, nose to nose, the Union Pacific S, Jupiter, and the Central Pacific S-119. It was a moment of national triumph, the physical realization of a unified continent. As the cheers erupted, Eliza put a hand on Thomas's arm. He was jobless, but he had his integrity. They had witnessed not just the building of a railroad, but the birth of the modern American economy and landscape. The old frontier was dead. The age of industry and corporate power had begun. They had survived the greed of gold and the madness of war, only to find themselves confronting the vast, impersonal forces of technological change. They were once again displaced, but they carried with them the certain knowledge that the American character was now irrevocably bound to steal. Smoke and speed? The year was 1888. The air in San Bernardino, California was dry, warm, and carried the distant, familiar sound of a locomotive whistle, still unsmoked legacy of their past. Thomas and Eliza Thorne, now in their late 60s, were no longer pioneers of the untouched wilderness, but respected elders in a town that had been physically born by the railroad they had helped build. After Thomas's dismissal from the railroad, they had used their small savings and Eliza's business acumen to open a permanent, thriving general goods store in this new, rapidly settled part of California. They sold shovels and seeds, but more importantly, they sold stability. They had survived the greed of gold, the brutality of war, and the cold indifference of corporate expansion. And they had emerged with something far more enduring than wealth, a moral legacy. Their personal conflict was resolved. The ideological battles of Bleeding Kansas had been settled by the war, and Thomas no longer wrestled with divided loyalties. His small act of defiance on the railroad, prioritizing safety over corporate speed, had been a quiet turning point, a final testament to the human worth. He and Eliza had defended their entire lives. Their story was now woven into the fabric of the community. They were the living history that connected the frantic, opportunistic past with the settled industrial present. Young settlers and their children who only knew the West as a place of commerce and established law would often gather by the potbelly, stove in the Thorne store to hear tales of the Oregon Trail as treacherous, thus the savage frenzy of the 49 camps and the chilling ideological warfare of the border states. It was never about the gold, son, Thomas would tell a young, ambitious man seeking his fortune. It was about what you were willing to sacrifice for it. The only thing of value we brought out of the rush was Elisa's good sense and the strength of our own two hands. Eliza's legacy was perhaps even more profound. In a society still struggling to define itself after the war and grappling with the complexities of industrial labor, she had become a staunch advocate for fair wages and safety, particularly for the Chinese and Mexican laborers who were often invisible to the town's power structure. Her store served as an unofficial sanctuary and resource center, an extension of the commissary she had run on the harsh tracks. The Union was saved, but the promise of the Union is still being built, she often asserted, her voice carrying the same no-nonsense conviction that had steered her through the plains. The ultimate resolution for the Thornes was the realization that their personal struggles from seeking land to seeking gold, and finally seeking justice, mirrored the evolution of the American nation itself. The country, too, was a restless entity, forever chasing a promise, often stumbling into moral darkness, but continually striving to correct its course. One crisp autumn morning, a special train pulled into the San Bernardino station. Among the dignitaries was Silas, the fiery jayhawker from Kansas, now an elected congressman. He had made the long journey west specifically to see the Thornes. Silas, older and softened by political life, embraced Thomas and Eliza fiercely. "You two are the bedrock," he said, stepping into their store and inhaling the familiar sense of coffee and leather. "You remember how we talked about whispers of the revolution? It wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in your store, Thomas. When you chose my life over your cousin's politics, It was one when you refused to lay faulty track, preferring the safety of strangers to the lure of money. He looked at the two of them, a man who understood the long arc of history. The bonds of 49 weren't the bonds of gold. They were the bonds of character. You kept your character. And that is your contribution to the future of this nation. The new dawn isn't the sunset over the Pacific. It's the integrity of the people who settled the land. As Silas departed, Eliza and Thomas watched the train disappear, its smoke quickly dissolving into the clean California air. They had not become rich in the traditional sense, but they had lived a life of consequence. Their story was the story of America, a messy, ambitious, often brutal, but ultimately hopeful journey from frontier survival to principled civilization. They had left behind the wilderness for the railway, the campfire for the potbelly stove, and fear for fulfillment. They were no longer chasing the myth of the West. They were its foundation. They had witnessed the birth of the nation's immense power, and in their own small, steadfast ways, they had ensured that this power was rooted, however imperfectly, in the enduring values of community and morality. A new dawn had indeed broken, stable and sure, over the vast complicated landscape they helped to shape.